Hello and welcome to Iain Dale All Talk and the Iain Dale Book Club podcast. We're going to do two for the price of one today because we're going to talk to Andrew Mitchell, who's written this book called Beyond A Fringe, Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey. Great cover as well. I don't know who drew that.
I think it's Miles Morland. It's E.T. flying over the top of.
And I should explain for people who are listening as opposed to watching. You're on your bicycle, sort of going past the clock tower of Big Ben.
The clock face. Yes. So that's the E.T. bit. Really.
Well, welcome to the podcast, first of all. Now, the subtitle of this book, I think, gives away the tone of it, because this is not a conventional political memoir. I know everyone says that they don't write a conventional political memoir, but this really isn't. Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey. It's actually a very funny book. And I was slightly surprised at how funny it was, which I don't mean in an insulting way, but I think it's quite difficult to carry off a book like this.
Well, it's very nice of you to say so. I mean, what happened was this, that at the start of lockdown, your friend, and both our friend and colleague of yours, Michael Crick, and I were having a chat on the phone. And I was in the countryside with my daughter and her fiancé and the dog in Nottinghamshire. My wife was in London treating the sick as a GP. And Michael was writing his book about Nigel Farage. And he said, what are you going to do in lockdown? And he said, well, why don't you write a book and tell all those funny stories you've told me down the years about the Whip's office and about Boris Johnson. So why don't you write a book? Because if you don't write it, I'm going to put it in my own diaries. And so sort of spurred on by that, I thought, well, I'll give it a go. So I looked after my constituents throughout the day. And then in the evening, I sat down and had a stiff drink and sort of sketched out a couple of chapters. And then I wrote them. And then I sent it to Michael, who, unbeknownst to me, sent it off to his agent. And his agent came back to me and said, look, this is good stuff. I think you should do more. So I did him the first 3 chapters, which are I hope quite sort of funny and entertaining, about my life at school and in the army and in the city and at university. Then one thing led to another, and I wrote the rest of the book. But the reason for the subtitle, Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey, is I've been a member, if you think about it, of almost all the, apart from the monarchy, of almost all aspects of the establishment. There's prep school, public school, the army, Cambridge, the city, Parliament and the cabinet, almost all of whose natures have completely changed. Some of them barely exist anymore. My prep school, where Boris and I were both at school at different times, has been abolished. So I just thought that many of these things have changed out of all recognition. There's quite a lot of interesting things to be said about them. I went back to Rugby a couple of years ago and spoke to the sixth form, and they simply could not comprehend what the school was like 50 years ago. And the truth is that Rugby school and schooling of that nature has changed out of all recognition in the last 50 years. In fact, 50 years ago, it was a school which Tom Brown, from Tom Brown's school days 200 years before, would have completely recognised. So that's one of the establishment institutions which has changed enormously. And throughout that time, my view of the establishment has changed too. I mean, to begin with, I was very much wanting to be part of it. And I'm not saying that I'm not part of it today, because if I did, Ian, you would roar with laughter and say, of course you're part of the establishment, and I am, but I am reformed, I hope, and a good deal more cynical about it. So I settled down to tell that story. But as you say, it is not a book from a politician trying to chart the route to utopia, nor is it self-justificatory. I'm trying to tell a story about change in all those areas, and I'm trying to entertain and I hope amuse, although there are 2 chapters about international development, which are, again, are not trying to justify or teach at all.
No, but they tell us things we didn't know. I mean, I learned a lot about how that department operates, about what you wanted to do there, which I wouldn't have known before. And you're right, those are the more serious chapters. But on virtually every other page, there's some very funny story that you've got to tell. I mean, did you find in the process of writing it that one recollection sparked off a few others which you'd completely forgotten about?
Absolutely, and that's exactly what happened. And I would make a sort of skeleton before. It would take me probably 2 days to make the skeleton, and then I'd write the chapter. But what I would do is I would call my wife after her busy day in London, in her London doctor's surgery, and I would read something out to her. And quite often she would peal with laughter, which was obviously encouraging for me. And then she'd
normally
say,
she doesn't laugh at any of your jokes. I do know that.
and then she'd say, "Hey, why don't you tell the story about X?"
Yeah.
And so that would then lead me off down another route. And I'd sometimes if I got the bit between my teeth, I could write quite a few words in an evening.
As you say, it's not self-justificatory, but it is explanatory. I didn't read it from page 1 to page whatever it's 350. I started at the end on the chapter on so-called Plebgate, because that, I think, is what a lot of people would want to definitely read about. And you don't tell the story sort of in all its gory detail. Just tell me how you approach that chapter, because judging from what you wrote, that bits of it were quite difficult to write.
Well, you're right. It is, I think, the shortest chapter in the book. And I wrote it last. And if I'd written it first, I probably wouldn't have written the book. So I wrote it last. And, of course, it was a terrible, searing time in my life. It came out of a clear blue sky. But I'm not refighting an old battle, and there are legal reasons, as you understand, why that is very difficult to do anyway. And I would make 2 points about it. The first is that I'm trying to explain what it's like to be caught up as an individual in one of these media squalls. And this one went on a very long time because there was no news. And because the police were furious with the government for changing their terms and conditions, and the media were furious with the government for the Leveson inquiry. So I put my head inadvertently into a huge noose. Or as I say in the book, I sort of led with my chin. And of course, the whole thing ended in a terrible mess, because although I lost my libel case in the courts, about 10 police were disciplined, several were fired or sacked for lying, one was sent to prison. So it all ended in a terrible mess. And the other thing I would say is this, that if you have, and lots of people have these terrible squalls in their life, and I'm not exceptional in that way, but if you have one of these squalls, there comes a point where you have to make up your mind whether you're going to sit and fester about it for the rest of your life. Like a maiden aunt in the corner of the party, talking about it and complaining about the injustice of it all and why it's so wrong. Or you say, look, there's a lot of life left. I'm drawing a line. I'm getting on with my life. It's in the past. And, whenever I sort of fell back from that view, there was the family and friends. I'm blessed with a lot of very good friends outside of politics and inside politics too, but particularly outside, to make me man up. So literally, just as David Blunkett told me, it takes 3 years to recover from these squalls, but after 3 years, you do have that option. You can either continue to fester about it, or it's in the past. And I was very, very clear. But I woke up, actually, almost exactly 3 years afterwards and realised that I hadn't thought about it for a week. So it was over.
So between the end of the libel case and that point, you literally thought about it virtually every day?
Not always, but it was a dominant thing. And also because it went on for so long, because we had to settle with all these lawyers, and these are quite extraordinary costs, which I do describe in the book. But as I say, it is the shortest chapter in the book. And while I completely understand why you, as a journalist, would start at that point, I very much hope, and I think it gives me a much better chance for the book to entertain, that others will start at the beginning, actually.
You tell an extraordinary story about the judge in the libel case, who some weeks or months afterwards you met in some club, or just by chance, And what did he say to you?
Well, he hailed me across the room of a London establishment club, and said he hoped that we weren't on bad terms.
You see, that is the establishment at work, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think the less said about the judge, the better.
The fact that you lost that case, I mean, clearly you must have then thought, well, should I have brought it? Were there lots of people telling you not to bring it?
It was a catastrophic error of judgment by me to bring that case.
And those who advised you to.
But there was mixed advice. There were people saying, don't go near the law on this. But remember, in the end, I couldn't escape because, as I said, I could have settled with the Sun. That was what would have been done. But the Police Federation were on my tail. And I found it astonishing that in a free society, if you say that the police are not telling the truth, they can effectively face you with bankruptcy. And I make clear that, that Sharon and I did not think we should be able to be bullied in that way.
One thing that I think comes over in that chapter is that you were getting advice from people who maybe didn't have your best interests at heart. When I remember the day when you appeared outside your front door, having, I think, been advised by Craig Oliver, David Cameron's Director of Communications, to do this. And you recount this in the book where I sent you a text message.
You called, actually.
Did I call? And I think I said, what the fuck did you do that for?
Yes, I think you said, who the fuck advised you to do it, actually, but the same sentiment. Yes, I mean, but by that stage, my judgment had gone. If you're caught up in these terrible squalls where, you're literally, you've got fleets of photographers outside the door, people banging on the door, people, behaving perfectly properly, but it's very intimidatory. And if you're besieged and attacked like that, it's quite difficult I find it very difficult to get out of bed quite often. So it's quite difficult to maintain your judgment, really. And I say in the book that I sort of lost my judgment after a bit. I recognise that now.
And was that because you were in a very dark place from a mental health point of view? Well,
it became like that, yes. And
because everyone that knows you, and I must admit, I didn't realise that you were in that dark place at the time. But anyone that knows you wouldn't think that you were the sort of person that would be affected like that.
Well, that was much later. I mean, I think that I was ill after the judgment and after the expenses. And when we were arguing about expenses, it went on for ever and ever and ever. And that was the difficulty.
Was it to the extent that you just literally didn't want to get out of bed, that you just stopped functioning as your normal self?
I couldn't. But eventually Sharon said, we've got to see someone. And there's a very brilliant consultant, psychiatrist, Jeremy Pfeffer, now sadly has died. And he looked after me, and I recovered, which is one of the reasons why I am so enthusiastic about campaigning for people to be able to get access to health services when they're going through these sort of mental health illnesses and difficulties.
Let's talk about your childhood, because normally in memoirs, I don't particularly enjoy reading about people's childhood, but yours, I mean, your anecdotes from your school days are just hilarious. And tell us about your family background, first of all, because your father was an MP. I knew him a bit when he was a transport minister, and a very great man. And he owned Elvinos, which anybody of a certain vintage would remember as a place where journalists used to hang out in Fleet Street, and sort of a specialist wine retailer. You had a fascinating family background.
Well, it's true. I was brought up in a wine family. And a political family too. So on the one hand, as far as politics was concerned, I had the opportunity of seeing at one remove the pluses and the minuses of a political career. And that, I think, is why quite often you do see people coming to the House of Commons who've had a forebear who's been in the House. There were actually two others in our family who were in the House of Commons, though that was back in the 19th century. They were both Liberal Democrats, actually, or Liberals, Whigs, actually. So I had the opportunity of seeing through my father's eyes what what politics was like, and also learning at the kitchen table about the constituency service element of politics, which is terribly important, because if you only go into politics because you want to be a minister and because you're ambitious for the limelight, you are doomed to be disappointed, because inevitably any career suffers serious reverses, and any political career has long periods where your party's not in government, or you're not in the right place in respect of your leader. So that was very helpful. But the other thing that happened was I learnt quite a lot about wine. In fact, I thought when I was younger I was always going to go into the wine trade. And the truth is that when I left university, or was leaving university, the family said, well, you haven't got a good enough palate, so why don't you go off into the city and learn about money? Because none of us know about money, but we all know an awful lot about wine. So if you want to contribute to the family, you're going to have to learn about something which adds value to us, and that will be money. So I went off into the city, and then I sort of got suborned by the city, and never went back near the family business, except in a very limited way. But suddenly, at the age of 40, I did develop a palate, and could, particularly on red wine from a certain part of France, and I could tell the difference, and I could understand it. And I think that gave my old dad a great deal more pleasure than anything I was doing in politics.
Because I tend to think of anybody talking about palates as being incredibly pretentious, and it's sort of, it's amusing in its presumption and all that sort of bollocks.
Well, there's a whole lexicon on that, of course, in politics. But the fact was that I didn't have, I'm sure both you and I can bullshit with the best of them. But the point is that with wine, there's a certain, and I didn't have it at all. So that was why that route of advancement in the wine trade was blocked off.
So tell us a bit more about Rugby and Cambridge, a few of the anecdotes you've got in the book.
Well, when I went out to Rugby, I mean, this is the point I was making about going to speak to the sixth form. They couldn't really comprehend it. The term before I arrived, if you didn't wear your school cap as you went out through the inner and outer door of Tudor House, you would be beaten at 6 o'clock that night by the head of house. And the loos had no doors on them. And, I mean, it was just a most extraordinary, different culture. And before that, I think my prep school, Ashdown House, whose masters were, an extraordinary collection of people who'd been in the war, because we're talking here 1964, 65 to 9. So it wasn't that long. It was less than 20 years after the war. And the thing I particularly remember was that the headmaster was very insistent that on 3 mornings a week there should be marching. And we'd all have to go out at 7:30 in the morning and stand on this sort of parade ground. And then we'd left, right, left around the school grounds. And I remember the headmaster saying that before the First World War, that was the only training some of the people at the school had before they got sent to the Western Front. And there was a big board up in the chapel with all the names of the boys who'd been at the school who'd lost their lives. And I remember thinking, and certainly remembering later, that was the only training they had before they went off to the Western Front. That tells you something about the nature of society in those days. And, of course, the quite appalling, extraordinary death toll that resulted.
Now, there is this... I don't know whether it's a myth or not. You say it is in the book that you had a nickname of Thrasher at Rugby. Any truth in that at all, or was it a journalist made it up?
It's not true. It was in Private Eye, the New Boys, just after I resigned, just after I arrived in the House of Commons. And of course, in those days there was a New Boys column, and we all waited. We New Boys, mainly boys. We all waited for our turn to come up in the column and for us to be, royally rubbished by the Private Eye journalist. And, if you weren't rubbished, people would assume you were a shareholder in the magazine or were a relation of the editor. And mine was remarkably benign, actually, but it did have this thing in it about how at school he was called Thrasher because he was a stern disciplinarian, like like at Eton, Hitler heard. So I thought, well, it isn't true, but it would be churlish to point this out. And besides which, being compared with Douglas Hurd seemed to me to be rather a compliment.
And also, when you became a whip, 9 years later, I suspect that might have been quite useful.
Well, I think I had an image as a bit of a bruiser as whip, but I think that wasn't. Whipping is complete. The reason I can write the chapter with all the stories about whipping in the book is because whipping has completely changed since those days, and it is above all the advent of social media which has changed it. I mean, if today the whips did the sort of things that we did, they'd be all over social media within a matter of 2 minutes. So it is very, very different now.
Were you a bit anxious about writing that chapter? Because when Giles Brandreth published his diaries and a lot of those were about being a whip, he got sent in the post a black spot because you're not supposed to break the whips of murder, are you?
Well, he didn't really break the whips of murder because Giles, either because he didn't know or because he was careful, didn't really put anything in that book which I think would cause embarrassment to a whip. The reason I can write that book and that chapter in the book is because it was a long time ago and whipping has so changed. And I'm quite careful not to put, if there's a story that's potentially embarrassing, there isn't a name there. But I'm quite careful not to do anything which my fellow whips at the time might feel was a breach of not etiquette, but a breach of principle, perhaps.
I think David Davis, who was a whip at the same time as you, I don't think he's ever read Giles's book because he still regards it as a complete betrayal.
That may well be true, but I don't think David will have any difficulty with my chapter. In fact, I think he'll rather enjoy it.
We'll get onto your time in Parliament in a moment, but you spent 6 years at Lazard Brothers.
More, actually.
And
6 years before Parliament.
Before Parliament. That must have been quite a culture shock because, of course, the city in the late 1970s, early 1980s, again, is not the city of 2021 by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, it couldn't have been more different. I mean, it was then comprised of upper-class English men, and it is English, not Brits, and normally very clever people from the East End who did a lot of the trading and the work and so on. And the thing I particularly remember, everything has changed, but there were people then running around the city in top hats. When the interest rate changed, it would be announced from the steps of the Bank of England, and I think either John Cornell or Thomas Crown, who were the head messenger, would both of whom had distinguished East End lineages, I may say, would sprint back to Lazard Brothers, as it then was, and run around the floors shouting, "No change, no change." And so, the idea of even telephony, let alone email, was not in any form of evidence. The city, people didn't make a lot of money in those days. You never talked about what you were paid. It was regarded as frightfully naff. Indeed, if you were to, it was a sackable offence at Lazard to talk about what you were paid or tell someone else what you were paid. And it wasn't actually until John Knott, who moved from Parliament and became the chairman of Lazard. First of all, he came in as a director and then became the chairman. It wasn't really till John was the chairman that Lazard started making real money. And it wasn't until the Americans arrived that the city did make real money. I remember there was it might have been Bear Stearns, but it was one of the Americans who had a trading floor in the city, and above it was written, "Let's make nothing but money." And it was an
very 1980s.
Yes, extraordinary culture change. And I owe Lazards a lot. I grew up there really after university, and saw all these changes, made, I think, what can only fairly be described as an exceedingly modest contribution to the firm. But many of my greatest friends are people I knew from that era.
But you had some amazing adventures, didn't you? I mean, I recall the once in Nigeria, the things was it Nigeria? No, the Ivory Coast.
I got caught in very close by. I got caught in a coup in a country that was called Upper Volta in those days and is now called Burkina Faso, which in the local dialect means country of incorruptible people, which was undoubtedly a breach of the Trades Descriptions Act. And I got caught there in a coup, and I was doing a deal for GEC, which of course no longer exists. And I was told by the Canadians who looked after British interests there that there was a German, he was the only other European, who was in Ouagadougou, which was the capital city of Upper Volta. And we went off and had dinner together. And as we came back, I remember the lights on the causeway flashed twice, which in hindsight was a signal. And we rounded in front of the presidential palace, and there was an armoured car or a tank firing machine gun shells into the front of the building. And I don't speak any German, but my colleague said "Scheisse, eine Coup d'etat," so I could manage that, and dropped me at the hotel where they were putting up sandbags, and the people, the staff, were in tears and very frightened. And I went back to my room, and I read Kenneth Harris's biography of Clement Attlee, waiting for the news. I had my little Grundig radio, and remember being extremely irritated when at 3 a.m, after lots of sort of news about Britain and around the world, as a final entry, there are reports of coup in West Africa taking place, which didn't seem to me to give the situation enough gravity. And then the next day, I got rid of my documents and moved to another hotel where, in fact, the chap who'd run the college bar at my university was also staying. He was selling grain to the regime. And
always who you know, isn't it?
And then the Americans said they'd let my mother know that I was all right. And as good as their word, they rang her up in London and said, "Your son is all right." And they said, "Where is he?" And she said, "Where is he?" And they said, he's in Upper Volta." "Where's that?" she said.
When did the political bug really first bite?
Well, I think it was probably at Cambridge, where, I was very lucky. I became the chairman of the Conservative Association and the president of the union there. And then I came to London and decided I should get a proper job and get my feet under a desk, and spent a lot of time working with British exporters on big ticket projects around the world. And I saw, that Britain was the sick man of Europe in those days. This was as Thatcher was starting, and Britain, and with her fantastic reforms as Prime Minister, that all started to change. But I used to sort of shout at the television, and friends of mine used to say, "Well, instead of shouting, why don't you do something about it?" And I then got involved at local level in Islington, where they flew the red flag over the town hall, and where they had what was referred to as a loony left council. And so I got involved, and it all sort of really stemmed from that.
And you stood in 83 in Sunderland South.
Yes.
How did that come about?
Well, I'd been abroad. Actually, I'd been living in Singapore for Lazard. And the role that I had was to act really as the firm's eyes and ears on what was then the biggest civil engineering contract in the world, which was the Singapore Underground Railway System. And unwisely, I wrote a note back to London with all the innocence of youth saying, "I don't think our client's going to win any contracts on this. The Germans are going to do all the electricals and the Japanese are going to hoover up all the construction." And so they said, "Well, you better come back." And I'd gone there in the knowledge that I would not be able to fight an election, but I thought the opportunity to go and work out east for Lazard was a more interesting way of spending a year or so. So I came back and I thought, well, every cloud has a silver lining. I'll see what seats are left. And there were 3 seats left which had not selected. One was Islington South, so I put my name forward for that, but there were a lot of other people who wanted to get into Parliament on the selection committee, so they certainly weren't going to give a leg up to one of their competitors, so they didn't interview me. And then, to my horror, I discovered that the other 2, Sunderland South and Jarrow, were both interviewing on the same night, so I had to choose. And I thought that Jarrow, with its iconic name, would attract, more competition. So I applied for Sunderland South, and I went up there and arrived in a taxi, and I'd been looking at the business, the private sector there, and I remember saying to the taxi man, what's his company Vaux beer like? And he said to me, not Vaux, Vaux, bonny lad, Vaux. And of course, had I gone into the selection and started talking about Vaux beer, I'd have been blown out the door. And I went in, and there was a woman, me, and the son of the borough engineer, who were the three candidates who got through that night. I scraped through that night. And as we were leaving, I remember the woman said to me, you do realise, don't you, that you and I are just here to make it look decent, because they're going to pick the borough engineer's son. He's a management consultant in London, and it's all set up for him. And being sort of innocent and inexperienced at that point, I believed her. And of course, as you and I both know, selections don't operate like that. But I believed her, and I was so cross because I thought, I've spent all this money coming up here, rented a hotel room and the train journey, and it's all set up. This is most unfair. So I sort of tore up the embryonic speech I'd prepared and spent the night working on what you say on the doorstep when someone says, why should I vote for your party? The pits have been shut, the shipyards are closing, unemployment's rising. What's Mrs. Thatcher ever done for us? And so the next day I went in all guns blazing, and I got it by one vote over the borough engineer's son. And as we left, this lovely lady came up to me, and she leaned towards me and she said my old school motto from rugby, Floriat Rugbeer. And I suddenly realised I'd sort of got it on the old school tie by one vote.
In Sunderland South. Who knew that would be possible? So you clearly got the taste for it then, and in 87 you got selected for Gedling, which I guess is one of those seats that in a good year would always be Conservative, but in a bad year wouldn't. Did you worry about that from the start, or was it only really as the 1990s progressed that you thought maybe that wasn't the one I should have gone for?
No, I mean, of my sort of self-confessed three great disasters in my political career.
Only three?
There's many other, the three great disasters. The first of them is losing Gedling, because, I mean, I inherited, I think, a 10,000 majority. In 1992, it was 16,000. So... But the difference between the Liberal and the Labour Party after 92 was that everyone knew to beat the Tory you had to vote Labour, and it wasn't split anymore. But losing that seat in 97 was, it was not a marginal seat. It was a safe Tory seat, but it was a seat that had been changing. It was a Poujadiste seat, really. It was full of small business people. And it was right up against the walls of Nottingham. So a lot of big houses lived in by Tory families, then lived in perhaps by a Tory widow, then were turned into flats, which had a lot of university lecturers from Nottingham coming. It was changing a lot. And I lost it in 97, and I fought like a tiger to keep it. When I came to write the thank you letters at the end, I mean, there was sort of 300 people to thank. And I'd seen it. Most candidates can tell what's happening, particularly if they hold the seat on the ground. And I sort of knew I was there or thereabouts until the last weekend. And I rang John Wakeham, my great friend and boss. I was his PPS in the House of Commons. Or had been his PPS. And he wasn't fighting a seat because he was standing down, but he was at Central Office, and he was wise, really, a very, very wise old bird. And I told him that I thought that things were not looking good, and I remember his response was, "You're right." But that weekend, I'd been in the most difficult part of the constituency, Netherfield, and I'd been walking down the road, and I'd seen a family coming towards me where I'd helped all three generations. So there was Granny, Mum, and a child in a pushchair. And I'd sorted out Granny's pension, I'd sorted out the child's nursery place. I mean, I'd done something for all three, and I knew them quite well. And so I said to the people who were with me, this will be all right, this will be encouraging. And I went up and stuck my hand out to the mum and said, do you think you might support me on Thursday? And she said, I remember, absolutely, she said, Mr. Mitchell, you're a very good member of Parliament, none better, but we're voting for Mr. Blair. And I said, well, hang on a minute, you can vote for me and have me as your member of Parliament, and Mr. Blair's going to win anyway, he's going to be in number 10, you have both of us. And she looked at me and she said, no, it's time for Mr. Blair. And I remember then turning rather crestfallen to the generous, decent people who were campaigning with me and saying, that is a pretty pivotal moment. And, of course, that's what happened.
I remember you telling me that anecdote some years ago, and I've always used that as evidence that you can have a good personal vote, but if the tides are turning against the party nationally, there's nothing you can do.
Absolutely
Jim
right.
Callaghan said that, didn't he, in 1979? He just said, the country has decided for change and there's nothing that we can do about that. And he was right. And that's what happened in 97. It's what happened in 2019 to an extent.
True. I mean, I think I put in the book that I literally signed letters for more than 24 hours. That's why people would feed me fish and chips and small Hamlet cigars. And I'd sign all these letters. I thought that if I'd written myself, "Dear Mrs. Snooks, yours ever, Andrew," or Andrew Mitchell, I thought that it would help. So, I mean, we did everything we possibly could. And then on the day, I remember sitting in Andrew and Jenny Collinson's house at just before 10 o'clock in their big black leather chair and knowing that my fate would be determined just after the bongs of the 10 o'clock news. And sure enough, they said what the figure was, the exit poll was, and I knew that I was out. And I went to the Count, very decent Labour candidate, beat me. His supporters simply couldn't believe it.
Vernon Coker.
Vernon Coker. And indeed, he was very nice then and in his maiden speech by saying whatever reason Andrew Mitchell lost, it wasn't because he was a bad MP. But out we went. And of course, the cameras were all coming from other counts. Ken Clarke next door had just declared, and so they were all coming across because they'd heard that Gedling was about to fall. And I remember very well two things. I remember, first of all, as we were driving out, one of these cameramen was in the middle of the road running, and Sharon, who was driving the car, started accelerating towards him. And I pointed out it wasn't his fault, so probably best not to. And then as we came down the ramp from the sports hall where it was, there at the crossroads, about 3 o'clock in the morning, was a fox licking its whiskers. And, you realise that Blair was going to abolish fox hunting. This was a country now where it was safe for the fox to come out and stand in the open there and say boo to anyone who came past.
You use another phrase that I often use in the book. There's nothing so ex as an ex-MP. And you decided that you weren't going to go back to Westminster during that Parliament, and I think you might have done once. How easy was it to pick yourself up from that?
Well, initially, I, of course, had an earning wife. So we'd gone down from 2 salaries in the house to 1 salary in the house. So I knew that we were okay, at least for a bit, but we had a big mortgage. And also I'd been a minister, so I'd been living on a minister's salary. And although that's a great deal of money, it was much less when I was outside than when I was outside Parliament. So I knew that I'd have to get a job, and I was slightly worried that I'd be like, after the Second World War, those wounded Italian war veterans would be outside the Vatican and the prelates would walk past and ignore them because they'd had a dishonourable war. And I sort of felt that coming from the Majorite junta in the new Labour dawn might be difficult. But Lazard very kindly invited me back and said, come back and make your way here. And I went back, and I had 3 absolutely glorious years until one night. I used to have dinner with William Hague, who's a great friend of mine, once a year. And we used to go to Rules in Covent Garden.
Very establishment. Very establishment
indeed. And we used to drink a lot of red wine. And I was there the night of a very difficult by-election, and I saw the steel in William's soul, actually. I'm very impressed. He would have been a very fine Prime Minister, William Hague. Anyway, he said to me, look, you can't go on like this, bicycling around London, making money. You've got to either run something or you've got to come back. And I was in my early 40s, and I thought, he's right, really. So I then started to dip my toe in the water for coming back. And I kept on coming second, and there was quite a lot of institutional resistance because I'd been a John Major whip over Maastricht, and associations had clocked that. So I came second quite a lot. And then I got very lucky in Sutton Coldfield, and have always felt at home there. It's a very one-nation, ancient royal town, and we often tend to end up in the right place. I mean, I came second to David Cameron in his seat just before Sutton Coldfield, and if you think about it, David was incredibly well suited to Witney. And actually, I think I'm well suited to Sutton Coldfield. It was like a sort of grown-up version of Gedling. and they've only had 4 MPs since the war, all of whom have been retreads. They're all people who've been in Parliament before. So I felt very happy when I was selected for Sutton Coldfield, and indeed have represented them for 21 years and enjoyed every day of it.
Now, in that 87 to 97 Parliament, you were a junior social security minister, a job that you didn't really want but didn't feel that you could turn it down. And then you became a whip. The chapter on the whips is really, really interesting. And as you say, it's very different nowadays, but particularly over Maastricht. Just take us through some of the experiences that you had on that.
Well, it became clear that we were in big trouble over Maastricht. And I became a whip in 1990, in the winter of 92. And I was in the whip's office till 95, and then I was a social security minister. I thought that John Major had done a brilliant job over Maastricht, because I thought he'd filleted the treaty, because he got out of it the monetary union, and he got out of it the social chapter, which of course Blair then put back. So I thought, why is anyone going to complain? But I remember at a One Nation dinner, One Nation being a sort of dining club of centrist Tory MPs, meets once a fortnight, still does. I remember John Major coming and explaining his strategy and thinking it was absolutely brilliant. And on the way out, some of the older lags saying, oh, no, it's not going to work, it's not going to work, it'll be very, very difficult. And of course, in those days, there was only about 2 people who wanted to leave the European Union. Everyone else wanted to rein it back
Richard
and so on.
Boddy and Theresa Gorman.
Probably, yes.
And there would have been a few more than that, but not many.
But not many thought we would leave.
No.
And people like Sir Bernard Jenkin have been utterly consistent throughout in their position on it. But in those days, I think most people didn't want to leave. And it was the most extraordinary experience. We never pulled votes except when we were -1. And we won every single vote apart from one, which we lost, and we overturned it the next day on a vote of confidence. But literally at 2 and 3 in the morning, we would be calling votes and winning them by 3 or 2. And we'd have to tour the lavatories and check who was there and who wasn't there, and whether the Irishmen were over from Northern Ireland. We had a spy in Aldergrove Airport, so we would know what was happening. And I saw more of my brothers, and it was brothers then in the whip's office throughout that period of time, than I saw of my family. It was a quite extraordinary period. And, the job of a whip is to secure the vote of the member of their flock for their party. And I think I describe how whips aren't moral or immoral, they're amoral. So if you're asked by the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to get through the slaughter of the firstborn bill, it's your job to go and explain to your flock that there are far too many firstborns. They fetter the opportunities and chances of the second and thirdborn. And have you seen, Iain, how in your constituency there are all these second and thirdborn? It's going to be very popular. So it's your job to secure the vote, and you do it by whatever means you can. I once saw David Lightburn, who was a wonderful man, but who was enormous, and was the sort of office enforcer, lift a very decent, nice colleague who was being troublesome off the ground by his collar and tie. He actually lifted him off the ground. I saw his eyes start to pop out of his head.
Jerry Hayes, wasn't it?
Jerry Hayes, yeah. Absolutely. And then, and it wasn't just the Tories who behaved like this, just in case there's any doubt about that. Jack Straw tells a tale about how he was voting against the Labour government earlier on, and he was put up against a wall by Walter Harrison, and he suddenly found his balls were being squeezed by the Deputy Chief Whip as he stood there in the corridor. Well, you could never do that sort of thing now, but it was a very different era. And as I say, that's part of the reason I can write about it.
Do you think that the Maastricht whipping was, in a sense, what made you? And I think David Davis, certainly you could say that about. But it came back to haunt him in the end, didn't it? Because he was seen as a bit suspect on Europe during the leadership contest, and his refusal to countenance leaving the EPP added to that. Yes,
it's an interesting point. He was just a brilliant whip. And actually, David and Greg Knight and Richard Ryder are the people who led on all of that, and they kept the party together, and they kept John Major in government night after night. And a big debt is owed by the party to all 3 of them. I mean, David has always been very Eurosceptic. I mean, I don't think anyone in the party now doubts David's Eurosceptic credentials.
But they did at the time, didn't
but he was
they?
but he was also, a very effective and good whip. Did it make me? I think that's a conversation when David Cameron asked me to move to be chief whip from DFID. I was very flattered, but I noticed we both tell the same story. He tells it in his memoirs, and I tell it in Beyond A Fringe, that I sort of said, do I have to do it? Because, DFID has brought out the sunny side, the enthusiastic, the passionate side of my politics and, I hope, nature. And whipping brings out the dark side and the sort of serpentine side. And, it sort of feels very negative. And he told me that I should do it. And he offered me a very good job before as Defence Secretary when Liam Fox resigned. I didn't feel I could say no again, otherwise he'd have fired me for being a bloody nuisance. You should do what the Prime Minister wants if you possibly can. And so I said yes. But so I don't think Maastricht determined my politics. I think that development determined my politics. And that Maastricht was not an aberration in any sense, but it was sort of the other side of the coin, really.
Let's talk about the 2005 leadership contest, where you were running the campaign. I was David Davis's chief of staff. That campaign started quite a long time before publicly it was admitted to, didn't it? Yes, I mean, it did. I mean, not least because there was a serious possibility that David might have run when Ian Duncan Smith departed and Michael Howard took over. And David thought about it over the weekend. He tested the water. He took advice from people like you and me. And in the end, he decided he wasn't going to run. And he would have done extremely well then. There's no doubt about that. But he didn't run because he thought it would be bad for the party, and Michael Howard was a more unifying figure. And, let's be fair, Michael Howard put us back together again and turned us back into a proper regiment. But David Davis's campaign is my second great political failure, because when I started being his campaign manager, he was miles ahead in the opinion polls and with colleagues. And by the time we got to polling day and the announcement of the results, he had lost. So I take quite a lot of blame for the tactics on that. And in particular, the great speech which at the conference, where the press all said that David Cameron made an absolutely brilliant speech and was the new man, and David made a appalling speech and was yesterday's story. That wasn't true, of course. David Cameron's speech was very good, but it wasn't as good as that. And David Davis's speech was a good speech, but it wasn't good enough. And their spin was better than ours. Their spin was much better than ours, and their spin throughout the conference was much better. I have a very different recollection of that speech to you, in that my recollection is that the speech was more or less written sometime towards the beginning of September. And I can remember going with David Hart, his press officer, to Edinburgh, where he was speaking to 250 Scottish Conservatives. And he did a speech without notes. And I remember turning to David and saying, I didn't know you could do that. Maybe we should do that at the conference. And then we both agreed that it was too late because the speech was more or less written. And we didn't think about that ever again, how things might have been different had we come back and said to you, what we should do, Andrew? Do a speech without notes. I wonder, I often think if things could have been different. But David wasn't a natural platform speaker, still isn't in a way. No, that is not his forte. But he has other... I mean, the reason I always supported David was because he is inspirational on social mobility. If you are a kid in Nechells or in Brixton, David is an example of how you can get anywhere in British society. And he has a brain like a steel trap, as we both know, and I think that was his great selling point. The problem with the speech, your story is not inconsistent with mine, because the problem with the speech is this, that I thought David's got behind him the best wordsmiths in the party. He's got you, he's got Paul Goodman, he's got Damien Green, he's got Robin Harris from the old Thatcher team, Nick Herbert. And I thought that you get all these people in a room and there'll be a puff of white smoke and a brilliant speech will emerge. And, of course, it isn't like that. It was a nightmare because I didn't well, my recollection, and I mean, sometimes your memory changes over time, but my recollection is that I didn't really have any part in writing the speech. I coordinated it all and got them all together. But I can remember sitting in a couple of the meetings thinking, oh my God, this is tortuous.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Because
exactly what happened.
I mean, Robin, who is a very, very great man and probably one of the best conservative thinkers in the last 50 years, very trenchantly Thatcherite in his approach. And Paul Goodman, shall we say, sort of a slightly different background. Nick Herbert, again, very different. And thinking about it sort of 15 years on, more than that, you think, well, that was always inevitably not going to work. And why didn't I see that at the time?
Well, I take a lot of responsibility for that. But also remember that Nick Herbert was always going to run the campaign. And then what happened was Howard Fleiss was defenestrated and Nick got his seat, and then Nick said, I can't run the campaign, perfectly fairly, but Nick was always the guy who was going to do it. You may remember a secret meeting at Screveton.
I do.
Where we were gathered together, and Nick and Andrew Haldenby from Reform delivered a talk in the afternoon about how, and we interrogated them about what David Davis what his contribution would be to the party and the country. But Nick wouldn't run the campaign, and I was certainly a very poor second to what Nick would have been.
Well, he would have been very different, but I mean, I think, again, looking back, I mean, I felt like, I mean, you're very kind about me in the book, but I felt like a square peg in a round hole in doing the job as Chief of Staff. I don't think I really understood what that job meant at the time. I would now, but I didn't then. And it was, I don't mind admitting, sort of the worst 6 months of my working life, because I didn't enjoy it. I felt that I wasn't doing what maybe I thought I would be doing at the beginning. And I used to attribute this to the fact that I didn't have the letters MP after my name. So I always felt slightly, I don't know, second-class advisor, if you see what I mean. But I think that was just my usual imposter syndrome, and it was my fault.
Well, I mean, well, for all of us, of course, it was like fighting a rearguard action. We were fighting a retreat.
It was after the conference.
It was, and you know, I remember George Osborne, who was running, who's a friend of mine, and we were close friends then, who was running David Cameron's campaign, coming to me and saying, I do hope you're not going to throw in the sponge, because if you do, we're simply not ready. And there were people saying who should throw in the sponge. People close to you and me and David who were saying that, but we didn't, and I think we fought a respectable campaign. But I remember leaving the conference, and there were all these bright, attractive young people in fleeces with change to win and some other sort of vacuous slogans at the railway station handing out leaflets, and one of them came up and beamed at me and handed out a leaflet, and we weren't handing out any leaflets, and I think, you know, from then the game was up, and it was a question of doing the right thing, making sure that David's voice was heard. And you mentioned the EPP, the European People's Party, which is a very interesting point, because David and I decided that we weren't going to leave the EPP, because being a member of the EPP gave you a chance to do things in Brussels and Strasbourg. It got you chairs of committees, and it meant that the British MEPs had a presence there. If you pulled out and joined some small group of right-wingers, then you wouldn't have that. So David faced down the people like John Hayes and so on, who wanted us to leave the EPP, and said we wouldn't do it. So, of course, they went off to David Cameron and said, will you leave? And David said, yes, of course. Which
at that point was politically very clever, but didn't it come back to bite him on the arse?
It didn't, but it did, absolutely, because he had sent poor old William Hague as Foreign Secretary around Shadow Foreign Secretary around Europe, trying to cosy up to some rather unusual bedfellows.
Have I ever told you my John Hayes story? On my first day as David Davis's Chief of Staff, he appeared round the door, and I didn't know him at the time. I knew who he was, but I didn't know him. And he basically said, I can deliver 35 MPs to you. You and I should be in regular touch, and sort of gave me one of his famous winks. I thought, OK, right. And then I was in Portcullis House later that afternoon, and I saw him go into David Willetts's office. And my good friend Mark Fox was helping David Willetts at the time, and I saw him later. I said, what did John Hayes want? He said, he promised he could deliver 35 MPs to us. And no doubt he did that with David Cameron, Liam Fox, whoever. He's quite an operator in some ways, but maybe not quite as good as he thought he was.
Well, never. I think we would both agree that the electorate, the Conservative Parliamentary Party electorate and selectorate are probably the most sophisticated but most devious electorate in the world.
There were people who commented on your friendship with George Osborne at the time, and even now I encounter one or two people who thought that you were not to be trusted at that time, that you were basically greasing up to George Osborne to get a job with David Cameron. Now, on the face of it, you can understand why some people might come to that conclusion, and you did get a good job under David Cameron. What's the truth?
Well, the truth was that George and I were and are good friends, and actually I think quite the opposite of that, the fact that we were good friends and the fact that when there was a problem or an issue between the two camps, he and I could disappear off and have a drink and sort it out.
And there was generally good relations.
Yes, there were. But I think part of the reason why there were good relations was because George and I were close and we would sort out the problems, because, you know, the two Davids are very unalike. And they're like chalk and cheese, really. And it could have been an extraordinarily fractious contest. It wasn't, thank goodness. And I do think part of that was down to the fact that George and I were friends. But I think you've got to have quite a suspicious mind to think that it was anything other than that.
Well, we are in the political world, Andrew. That's what happens, isn't it?
And actually, afterwards, when the party came together, David Davis was very keen the party should come together. And I'm quite sort of open about that. I think I say in the book that some people did think I was too close to. But David Davis wanted the party to come together, and Cameron, I remember, said to me, "Mitch, I want to promote you. Would you like to be Work and Pensions Shadow Secretary?" And I said, "Well, it's all the same to you. Actually, I don't regard it as a promotion. I'd much rather continue to do international development, which I've been doing for 6 months and was really starting to get into." And of course, it meant that I was doing something where the party leader, who I had opposed to be leader, and I were completely on the same page. We both believed passionately that Britain had a leadership role here in international development and could move the dial. And so in that sense, it was an absolute blessed relationship. And I tell you this, when we could complete each other's sentences. And in my time as the cabinet minister responsible for DFID, there were 2.5 years. There were on 3 occasions a time when the Whitehall machine didn't want me to do something and went behind my back to Cameron. And on all 3 occasions, Cameron said no. And I think Andrew's right. We'll go with Andrew. And that's a you know, for a cabinet minister to have that sort of relationship with their boss, the Prime Minister, is a very, very helpful, blessed thing.
Well, when I saw David Cameron, I interviewed him when his memoirs came out, and I can't remember whether he said this during the interview or when we were chatting afterwards. And he told me that he had intended to, if he had still been Prime Minister after the Brexit referendum, he was going to bring you back after your resignation. Do you think that, in retrospect, he regrets acting so quickly and telling you that you had to go after all the Plebgate thing, given all the evidence that came out that basically you'd been stitched up?
Well, I think you have to say this for Boris, that when a colleague is wounded, he forms a square around them. Think about Pretty, for example, under a lot of pressure, and he formed a square around him. I think that David was not as good with colleagues as that. And with me, he worried about the police vote. I think he worried about law and order. I think he worried about, and you know, I had told the police where to get off for blocking I was one of the 3 senior ministers in Downing Street. They're there to protect us. They shouldn't be blocking, you know, ministers bicycling in and out. Indeed, there are photographs of Boris bicycling in and out of Downing Street from a few weeks before. So I think that you can say that for Boris. I think that David did not. I talked him out of trying to get my resignation, as in the book. But after 3 weeks, I mean, it was Alistair Campbell who once said that no minister can survive being in the eye of the storm for more than 2 weekends. So that's sort of 9 days. I did 33 days, and by the time I was nearly dead by then. And when I resigned, I was driven to Chequers to resign. I was on my knees by then. So, I mean, I don't think he would have put up with it much longer, but I think that, I did have 33 days to try and see if I could survive.
But did you know that he was going to bring you back?
I think I read it in his autobiography, I think. Yeah. And I think I did know. I think he told me that he was going to bring me back. But then he lost the referendum.
Well, quite. Let's talk a little bit about your time at DFID, because it was clearly a job that you absolutely loved. And I think it's really good that you've explained in so much detail what you wanted to do, why you wanted to do it, and how you did it. Because you kind of got religion on it, didn't you?
Yes, you said that before on interviews. I think I remember doing an interview from Ditchley, I think, with you in between meetings when something terrible had happened, and we both were agreeing on the importance of international development. I mean, those 2 chapters in there, because this is my third great disaster in politics, is that we've never managed to win this argument with the British public. We've never got the polling to move above 54% of support for international development. I mean, I believe passionately that Britain has been a world leader in international development, and that has been about British knowledge and expertise about what you do to tackle these extremes of poverty around the world. And it is basically to try and stop conflict, to stop it starting if you possibly can, but if it starts, to stop it and then to reconcile people. Conflict is development in reverse. And to try and build prosperity, because if you have a job or you're economically active, you can work your way out of poverty. So those are the sort of 2 twin pillars. But it's not just about doing it because it's the right thing to do for some of the poorest people in the world. It also makes us safer and less endangered and more prosperous here. Why? Because poor countries that lift their living standards will come to the British capital markets, because Britain is a leading international centre, and because if there is peace and no conflict in Somalia, they won't be training up terrorists to come to Britain. So I think that the failure to win that argument is weighs heavily on me. I'm disappointed that we've never yet managed to do it. We got close to doing it, mainly because we've had prime ministers in David Cameron and Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and to a significant extent Mrs May as well, who believe the same. But Boris obviously doesn't, and you cannot possibly win the argument if you've got a Prime Minister who says from the dispatch box that DFID is a sort of giant cash machine in the sky pouring money out. The public are never going to accept that. So the point about those 2 chapters is I'm not trying to proselytise. I'm not trying to prove a point.
I think you underestimate the impact that you had in that job on fellow Conservatives, in that, I mean, I'm not sure I gave international aid much thought before going with you on that trip to Rwanda.
Yes, came to Project
and that was a bit of an eye-opener, and I constantly quote that now whenever we do phone-ins on LBC about international aid, where you would get people say, oh, it's all a waste of money and it's all goes to these corrupt dictators in Africa. And I say, well, hang on a minute, I've actually seen something good where British aid has really helped a country. And I'm sure there will always be a part of it that goes where it shouldn't do. That will always be the case. But you introduced transparency. I think, was it any expenditure over £500, you introduced a system where the general public could examine that. So I think you do yourself a disservice, actually, by saying that was a failure, because I think you made more impact than any other international development secretary.
Well, it's kind of you to say so. I think that the fact is, though, that we didn't win the argument with the public, because if we'd won the argument with the public, we wouldn't have gone back on our promise on the point 7 and vaporised DFID. But the point I was making about those 2 chapters is I'm not trying to proselytise. I'm trying to tell a story about why I thought it was the sort of things we did which we thought were important, so that anyone reading it can say, maybe they'll say they don't agree, but maybe they'll say, yes, I see why that was in our interest to do that, and I see why the government wanted to do that, and I see what that meant for a country a long way away, but I also see what it meant for us. I mean, the example of the Somalia conference in London, which had a funny side to it, which I tried to bring out, is instructive, because Britain basically stopped a famine in the Horn of Africa back in 2011, where there were terrible forces at play, and we led the world in making sure that people did not die of starvation. And afterwards, David Cameron said, look, we've spent money on Somalia trying to save these people's lives, but there are people there trying to kill us. Can't we do more to help build a state? And so we did that, and we corralled in other countries. We had this big conference in London, and Somalia is better today, quite a lot better today, than it was then. And that makes us safer here, because in those days, there were more British passport holders training in terrorist camps in Somalia than there were in Pakistan or Afghanistan. And so by building some sinews of order and making the space less ungoverned in Somalia, we make ourselves safer too, and ultimately more prosperous as well. So it's not just about altruism; it's also about hard national interest.
Let's talk about Boris, because you were vice chairman in charge of candidates when he was put on the candidates list, and it's quite entertaining, the account you give of that, where John Major was not very pleased with you.
No, he wasn't at all. What happened was that there was behind the scenes, the party has structures for selecting candidates, and you're not supposed to decide whether someone should be the Member of Parliament Sutton Coldfield. You're merely supposed to decide whether or not they are electable and selectable, whether they are Tories. And it was perfectly clear to me that Boris was a Conservative and brilliant and a bit of a maverick, but had a huge contribution to make to the Tory party, and particularly the MEPs who had known him when he was the Telegraph correspondent in Brussels, writing about how John Major wanted to straighten out all the bananas and cucumbers, with the Commission having a similar view. He'd antagonised them by his writing, and he certainly antagonised John Major. And in the end, the party's structures held, and Boris went through. And I remember Norman Fowler coming up to me after a 10 o'clock vote one night and saying, Prime Minister's not very happy. You're going to have to go and see him and explain. And so the next night after the vote, I went to see him in his office behind the Speaker's chair, the Prime Minister's complex. He was standing by the fireplace, and his opening remark was, "What the fuck do you think you're doing, putting Boris on the candidates list?" And I explained to him what had happened, and that I'd extracted from Boris a promise that he wouldn't stand for a winnable Conservative seat. And John, to his credit, let it go, because he could have said no, he's not going on, but he let the matter rest with the decision that I had made.
But Boris broke that promise, didn't he?
Well, I think,
which was a sign of things to come from your point of view.
Well, I think he forgot. And let's be charitable. But I was one day working in Conservative Central Office, which was then in Smith Square, and I was looking down a long list of Conservative applicants for a very safe home counties European seat, and there was, under the J's, was Boris, and we'd agreed that he wouldn't do that. So I rang him up, and after a certain amount of huffing and puffing, he withdrew his name.
But that story has an ending, a much more recent ending, where he persuaded you to support him in the 2019 leadership campaign, and I think you've come to regret that, haven't you? Well,
I don't know about regret it. I tell you what I do think. I think that we got Boris and Theresa May the wrong way round, because Boris would have been the right Prime Minister to get Brexit through, as he has done. Whereas Theresa, the reason I didn't support Theresa, for whom I have a great deal of respect and regard, was because I didn't think the party could be led by someone who was not a Brexiteer. And that's why I voted, after Boris drove off the road, drove himself into a ditch, I voted for Michael Gove, because I thought the party had to have a Brexiteer leader. So to that extent, I think that Boris was the right person. We needed someone who could get it through, and he did, and he got us a majority, and he got all those red wall seats to support. But certainly on the three promises he gave, one of which was that he would not abolish DFID, and the second one was that he would not go back on the 0.7. Let's be charitable and say he changed his mind.
But he also, he did caveat this by saying, look, I'm not offering jobs, but he certainly led you to believe that you would be back in the cabinet. Yes,
and I think I quote one of his texts in the book. And who knows what will happen, Iain, but it certainly hasn't happened so far.
I mean, at some point, surely these lies and deliberate evasions are going to catch up with him.
Well, I have no idea what's going to happen. I do think he's an extremely colourful one-off Prime Minister. I mean, Boris is unique, and you have to hand it to him. He won all those seats. He got us the biggest majority, I think, since 1983. And, you know, once I knew that Sutton Coldfield...
87.
Was it 87, was it? Mm. So it's very, very significant achievement by him. And it was his achievement, because once I knew that I thought Sutton Coldfield was okay at the last election, I went to the Red Wall seats in the West Midlands and campaigned there. And I used to say to people, are you going to vote Conservative? And they said, no, I'm going to vote for Boris. Mm. And so his contribution is immense. The issue, of course, is you've got to keep this coalition together. And David Cameron got us our first majority for 23 years, because the last time was in 1992, in 2015. And he did it by winning all those Lib Dem seats, because people in the centre of politics who care about internationalism and development and are socially liberal, they voted for David Cameron. And what we don't want to happen to the Tory party is that we add on the Red Wall seats while losing those seats that we won, first of all, in 2015. And so I think it's very important to maintain that coalition, which is why I've been so outspoken on the issue of development, which for some of our supporters is very important indeed.
Do you think you're a nicer person now than you were 20 years ago?
Well, I'm certainly a wiser person, I think. Nicer? I don't know. I mean, I think we're all formed much earlier on. Maybe I am, but I think that's for you to judge rather than me, really.
Well, I think you are. I think maybe it was the combination of the failure of the Davis leadership campaign plus your clear love of the international development portfolio. I think they turned you into a much nicer human being.
Well, I hope you're right.
What a way to end. Listen, it's been an absolute pleasure. And I enjoyed this book possibly more than any other that I've enjoyed this. I keep saying this, everybody I interview, I say I enjoy your book more than I've enjoyed the others. But I just read Michael Cockerell's and Gavin Barwell's, which are both brilliant. But I think you kind of just about top them. So well done for that. The book is called Beyond A Fringe, Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey. It's by Andrew Mitchell, published by Biteback in hardback at £20. Andrew, thank you very much. And join us again next week. Goodbye.